Sego Ani. Kanoshinwake Magazine Indigenakas Makwadodum. Hello, my name is Bob, and I'm a senior fellow with First Peoples Group, and we are partnering with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation to bring you a series of videos on the topic of anti-Indigenous racism. Today, we will be diving into our third video, focusing on anti-Indigenous racism in the education system. During this video, you will review the definition of anti-Indigenous racism, study the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action pertinent to education, and describe how you can breathe life into reconciliation from your own positionality. Let's take a moment to remind ourselves of what exactly anti-Indigenous racism is. Anti-Indigenous racism is defined as the ongoing race-based discrimination, negative stereotyping, and injustice experienced by Indigenous peoples within Canada. It includes ideologies and practices that contribute to the establishment, maintenance, and perpetuation of power imbalances, structural obstacles, and inequitable results in Canada as a result of colonial policies and practices. What are some examples of anti-Indigenous racism? In our previous videos, we explained that according to the National Collaborating Centre for Indigenous Health, within Canada, anti-Indigenous racism is expressed in numerous ways, through stereotyping, stigmatization, and violence, as well as through many of the structures of Canadian society. An example of anti-Indigenous racism expressed through stigmatization and violence include, according to the television series Taken, hosted by Anishinaabe producer Lisa Miches, Indigenous women are 12 times more likely to be missing or murdered than other women in Canada. In our last video, we learned a great deal about the Indian residential school system. Now let's take a look at what has occurred since the closure of these institutions. The Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history, began to be implemented in 2007. One of the elements of the agreement was the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada to facilitate reconciliation among former students, their families, their communities, and all Canadians. Between 2007 and 2015, the TRC spent 6 years traveling to all parts of Canada and heard from more than 6,500 witnesses. The TRC also hosted 7 national events across Canada to engage the Canadian public, educate people about the history and legacy of the residential school system, and share and honor the experiences of former residential school students and their families. In June 2015, the TRC held its closing event in Ottawa and presented the executive summary of the findings contained in its multi-volume final report, including 94 calls to action to further reconciliation between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. The 94 calls to action are organized in the following subheadings: child welfare, education, language and culture, health, justice, and reconciliation. There are numerous calls to action which focus on education, and we encourage you to explore them to further your learning. Today, we will zoom in on 4 calls to action. Call to action number 8. We call upon the federal government to eliminate the discrepancy in federal education funding for First Nations children being educated on reserves and those First Nations children being educated off reserves. Call to action number 10. We call upon the federal government to draft new Aboriginal education legislation with the full participation and informed consent of Aboriginal peoples. The new legislation would include a commitment to sufficient funding and would incorporate the following principles: providing sufficient funding to close identified educational achievement gaps within one generation, improving education attainment levels and success rates, developing culturally appropriate curricula, protecting the right to Aboriginal languages, including the teachings of Aboriginal languages as credit courses, enabling parental and community responsibility, control, and accountability, similar to what parents enjoy in the public school systems. Enabling parents to fully participate in the education of their children, respecting and honoring treaty rights. Call to action number 11. We call upon the federal government to provide adequate funding to end the backlog of First Nations students seeking a post-secondary education. Call to action 62. We call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments in consultation and collaboration with survivors, Aboriginal peoples, and educators to make age-appropriate curriculum on residential schools, treaties, and Aboriginal peoples' historical and contemporary contributions to Canada, a mandatory education requirement for kindergarten to grade 12 students. Provide the necessary funding to post-secondary institutions to educate teachers on how to integrate Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods into classrooms. Provide the necessary funding to Aboriginal students to utilize Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods in classrooms. Establish senior-level positions in government at the Assistant Deputy Minister level or higher dedicated to Aboriginal content in education. What can we do to combat anti-Indigenous racism in the education system? Unlearn or relearn the history of Turtle Island? Land acknowledgements are an entry point. By the way, if you haven't already checked out our video on this topic, you can find it in our video library. Indigenous voices in your classroom, library, or library at home. Engaging with Indigenous communities meaningfully. Teaching Indigenous histories and perspectives outside of holidays or special months. Not all Indigenous practices or knowledges are to be experienced. Some require special permission. Indigenous peoples were here, are here, and will be here in the future. We hope you enjoyed engaging with this topic today. Nyawe, miigwech, thank you, merci.